It's the mother of all drive times with me, George Galloway. Well, I'm going to be speaking about France. France, why, you may say, trifle esoteric on talk radio from London, is it not? No, it's not. Because if Marine Le Pen wins the presidency of France in 3 months, 12 weeks from now, there won't be any European Union to withdraw from, and the EU will not be driving any kind of hard bargain with the British Prime Minister because they won't be in a position to bargain at all. That's the stakes in the French presidential election. And until in the last few days, I would say, maybe 5 days, it looked a straight shooter. The French presidential election was going to be between the right and the far right, between François Fillon and Marine Le Pen of the National Front. But the mainstream conservative candidate for president, who was the bookies' favourites for the Élysée, has crashed and burned in a scandal of the most ancient kind over greed. His wife had said many, many times over the years that she had nothing to do with politics. She was a simple housewife, as she used to put it, in her British way. But it turns out 800,000 euros were paid by the French taxpayer to Madame Fillon in wages as her husband's parliamentary assistant. And now the police are in. They raided the Assemblée Nationale yesterday and took away lots of documents, and the allegation is that she never once showed up for work and that it was a ghost job, allegedly. But it's almost certain that the mainstream conservative will have to withdraw from the race, and probably by this weekend, which will mean that there's a very real chance that the presidential election runoff will be between France's Jeremy Corbyn, yes, that's what they call him, because he took the leadership of the French Socialist Party by storm and absolutely against the predictions of all the pundits and pollsters, just like Jeremy Corbyn did. His name is Benoît Hamon, and if he's France's Jeremy Corbyn, then he's going to be up against not France's Theresa May, but France's Nigel Farage to the time 10, maybe, to the power of 10. That's going to be the mother of all presidential battles. And as I say, if Le Pen wins, the EU is history. Which brings me to my second subject, which is the White Paper, 77 pages long, introduced by my old friend, the Right Honourable David Davis today, but he could have introduced it in 5 minutes, and the 77 pages could have been distilled somewhat. There was a lot of white space in the White Paper, and that's because people are making a meal of something that is absolutely simple. All you have to say to the EU is we are leaving and we're not going to be sending you any more money. Number two, we have no intention of introducing tariffs or barriers on your goods and services, and we trust that you will not introduce any barriers or tariffs on ours. Number three, we have no intention of asking any EU citizen already living here to leave, and you may or may not decide to reciprocate. Number four, henceforth, our Parliament is sovereign. Our courts are sovereign. We will no longer be told what to do by the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, or the European Commission, or the European courts. And number five, just for your information, we have no intention of having any less standards of environmental, labour, human rights and other protections than you in the EU will continue to enjoy. Full stop. End of email. End of White Paper. It's really as simple as that. And those who are trying to make it more complex are doing so because they want to derail the process. They want to stop the Brexit, or to make it as minimal a Brexit as it's possible to do. Well, that won't wash, because all the polls suggest that the 17.25 million people who voted to leave, about a half of the people who voted to stay have accepted that we are leaving, and that therefore there's nothing more on that to argue about. As to what kind of Britain we'll have after that, that, dear listener, is a matter for us. That's the beauty of Brexit. If we have a right-wing, red in tooth and claw, free market, TTIP type government, privatising our NHS and all the rest, that'll be because we voted for it. If, on the other hand, we don't want that, we feel perfectly free to elect a government that will do things differently. And I'll be in the front line arguing for just such a government. Now, the issue of immigration looms large over all of this, and I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about immigration tonight. No one can credibly accuse me of being against immigration. My grandparents immigrated to this island from Ireland as economic refugees in their bare feet, and walked 80 miles from Glasgow, where they landed, in their bare feet, to go and work in the jute mills in Dundee from 6 in the morning until 6 at night for 10 shillings and 9pence. That's just over 50p for younger listeners. I am the father of 2 Arabic children and 2 Indonesian children. I have represented in Parliament more immigrants than any member of Parliament in British history. Yes, in British history. In the East End of London, in West Yorkshire, in Bradford, and in Glasgow. Nobody can accuse me of being a racist, but I am absolutely convinced that the end of what's called the free movement of labour, which actually is the free movement of Central and East European labour, which is overwhelmingly white, by the way, is bad for the British working class and bad, therefore, for British society, because it puts pressure on wages, because it drives down conditions, because it cuts employment opportunities, and because it puts pressure on rents upwards and public services downwards. But that doesn't mean that I'm against immigration. On the contrary, when we leave the European Union, we're still going to need immigrants. And the big question is, where will these immigrants come from? How will they be, as it were, chosen? Who will be allowed to immigrate here and who will not? Well, I have this view. You may have a different one. I've always felt that we owed a far bigger debt of gratitude to the countries of our own Commonwealth who stood with us in our hour of need when we were alone, standing up against Hitler at the Channel ports. The British Commonwealth sent people and material to help us. And I've always felt that a family of nations with a common cultural and historical thread was the best place for us to take our immigrants from. I never felt that we owed Germany or Romania or Bulgaria or all the other places that were fighting with Hitler against us. I never felt historically that we owed them anything in terms of immigration. So, in my view, it'll be turning the clock back to the 1960s, when ships were arriving from what we then called, foolishly, the West Indies, and from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and the rest. I'll be talking to Lord Andrew Green, the chairman of Migration Watch, on this very shortly. Now, it turns out there are something like 3 million EU citizens already living in Britain. No sane Prime Minister, no sane government would ask any of them to leave. They are living here, some of them, for a long time. It must be a part of the final EU Britain's settlement that the EU citizens who wish to remain here must be fully welcomed and allowed to continue to do so. It turns out also that there are rather more British citizens living in EU countries, some 5 million of those. So this is going to be, on one level, an easy deal to reach. Or is it? Well, some Tories are threatening to revolt against Theresa May if she dares to permit the 3 million European citizens living here to continue to do so. You couldn't make that up. Now, I spoke about those with whom we had a long and historic relationship. One of those, of course, Poland, whose brave pilots fought in the Battle of Britain, and we certainly owe a debt of friendship to them. And their UK correspondent for the Polish press agency is Jakub Krupa, who joins me now to discuss this very subject. Jakub, welcome.
Good afternoon.
What's the feeling in Poland, and so far as you can discern across the European Union, about the issue of your citizens remaining here and our citizens remaining over there?
I think there seems to be a consensus that that's certainly something that should be dealt with at the very start of the negotiations. Obviously, I think both sides, both the 27 members of the European Union and the UK government, recognise that, as you rightly pointed out, it involves loads of people, like millions of people living in both countries. Now, when we think about the population in the UK, of the EU nationals living in the UK, I think that this is a particularly concerning thing, because so far we haven't had a single guarantee from any member of the government saying openly that we will guarantee that. We have heard a lot of political talk about our wish, the British government's wish to guarantee that, to be able to guarantee that in the upcoming talks. But as we will proceed forward, especially after the Article 50 gets triggered, understandably, the level of anxiety among Polish people and other people living in the UK will certainly go up. And I'd expect the government to certainly be able and be willing to reassurance to those people who have invested the future in the UK, who decided to make the UK their home. And I know that many of them now are withholding decisions on the future, or about where they want to invest the money, or they want to buy houses and properties in the UK, where they want to invest more money in their businesses. I mean, the economic case, as you rightly pointed out, for the EU migrants living in the UK is absolutely clear. They make a multi-billion net contribution to the British budget every single year. Now, I think this point doesn't come across too often in the public debate, and I think it is up to the government to make that point in the argument and in the debate with the Conservative MPs, saying that basically it would be an act of self-harm if the British government would not guarantee that right to people who, as I said, invested the future in the UK.
Well, it would be, I think, most un-British and certainly disgraceful if any person was asked to leave here that is living here lawfully now. And not least because there are more of us living over there than there are of you living here, albeit most of our 5 million are living in a very few countries. There are quite a lot of Polish people living in Britain, not many British people living in Poland and so on, but that's immaterial in my view. I suppose the government is putting this on the table as part of the negotiations, and you could hardly blame them for that, really.
I mean, it's understandable that this is part of negotiations. Obviously, if you want to reform the freedom of movement and future relations and regulations concerning freedom of movement, that's certainly a part of these talks. However, as I said, I mean, it's really important to get the reassurance in that as soon as possible. People will be anxious about the future in the UK, will be worrying about that, will be hesitant about what to do. And I think there's a big problem as well concerning wider immigration rules to the UK. A lot of EU nationals who live in the UK now for many, many years, some of them way more than the 5-year threshold in the Immigration Act now, simply don't know what to do if they have to apply for any specific permits to guarantee the rights to stay in the UK in the future. They have never had to think about it being EU nationals in an EU country. But now, if there's a lack of political decision to guarantee the rights to them, they'll be immediately going to Home Office asking them, why? By the way, could you please help us fill in the documents? Could you please help us with processing this application? Which obviously would lead to a clog and a problem with the process of this application. So I think in everyone's interest is to avoid that and to guarantee the rights of these people, to make sure that they can stay here. And indeed, you're right in saying that that would be a very British thing to do, to actually guarantee the right to stay in the UK. A lot of people I spoke to, obviously immigrants, including Polish people, but not only, were telling me that,
Well, unfortunately, I felt that was going to happen. We've lost Jakub. It was a deteriorating line. Let's hope not a deteriorating situation so far as the rights of European citizens living here are concerned. I would have, if he was still on the line, have made one or 2 points about the system of work permits and so on. There's nothing draconian or dreadful about requiring people to have work permits to work here if they retain the citizenship of other countries. That's, after all, what Australians and Canadians and Americans have to do here, and it's what many people in most countries in the world have to do. But that's a different thing from turfing them out. I'll be talking to Lord Andrew Green, the chairman of Migration Watch, in the second part of this first hour, and we'll be talking about immigration as a wider issue, how vital it is, how important it is, but how important it is to control it also. We'll be talking about the Brexit white paper and what that means for business, for industry, and so on, and we'll be talking about France. Now, you thought I was only talking to Britain, but here's a listener in Phoenix, Arizona. Saeed on the line. Welcome to you, my dear Saeed.
Thank you, George Galloway. First of all, I thank you all for letting me the chance to speak with you.
Not at all.
And it's my first time I'm talking to you. I'm one of your biggest followers.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. I've spoken in Phoenix, Arizona, by the way. It's a wonderful place.
It is. In fact, it's a sun state. So my question regarding was Mr. Donald Trump's recent action, what he's been doing. Mm-hmm. It's when I look into all this perspective, it just makes me feel insecure because I'm also a permanent resident. I'm a Pakistani, but I'm also a permanent resident of the U.S., and I'm a law-abiding citizen of my country. I'm a law-abiding citizen of the U.S. I pay taxes over here, and I'm a smart Pakistani at work, and I'm a productive Pakistan who's contributing to the American society. So when I see these kinds of things, what he's been doing on, and the fools who are following him, makes me really angry that if you look into the stats, what he gave the bans on those 5 countries had nothing to do with the terrorism in the U.S. In fact, most of the terrorists never even came from those countries he put on the bans on. That's the worst part. The other part is that what he's giving promises, he's just trying to show his image to the most foolish of the foolish people of the society which voted for him, that he's doing something which is going to change this country better again. The problem with the American economy is not by the immigrants. The problem with the American economy is that overextended military budgets and expansion of imperialist empire all around the world, which they want to make the world into the way they want it. And the second is the big companies on these banks which are robbing the people. Most of these big companies, they have their joint ventures overseas. Secondly, he talks about the wall, Mr. George Galloway. That wall won't bring any change because if you look into that wall will be paid by us as a taxpayer money. And then he's going to impose tax on importing something from Mexico. So you have to realize that America doesn't export anything to Mexico. In fact, it's an importer. America always trade like almost $7 billion every year with Mexico as an import. So the things right now which we are getting cheap in the market from Mexico, for example, when I go to grocery stores, most of the fruits, vegetables, the basic commodities, they all come from Mexico. So assume that those all we're going to go to a rise because he's imposing 25 and 30% tax on those ones. That's insane. And secondly, when he talks about building and coming in and you're going to bring the factories again, that's impossible because the standard of living in the U.S. is so high, the labor wages are so high. Even if he brings in the factories over here, the cost of the production is so high, who's going to buy that thing? The Chinese can make those same things much more cheaper way.
Yes,
so he
but
cannot compete to that global market.
But Saeed, you have to. There are people in the world who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And the logic of what you just said at the end there is that we just make everything in Southeast Asia and we sit here and consume it. But consume it with what? if we have no wages, if we have generated no wealth, then we will not be able to buy imports, however cheap they are. So what Trump is saying he's trying to do, now there's a big caveat there, we'll have to see if he does it, if he means it, is that he wants to return production, manufacturing to America. And if he does that, I'll support him, because I think it is important not to permit this globalization of capitalism to the extent that the 1% cream off all the wealth and all the work goes to the poorest countries in the world, leaving unemployed tens of millions, scores of millions in the former industrialized countries. He won the presidency not because, as you put it, stupid people voted for him. Actually, it was people voting for him out of their own interest. If you were an unemployed steel worker in Ohio, an unemployed auto worker in Michigan, if you were an unemployed coal miner in Virginia or in Pennsylvania, you were doing the smart thing, voting for Donald Trump, because he's going to reopen the mills, reopen the factories, reopen the mines, or at least that's what he says he's going to do. Now, on the question of the travel ban, first of all, it's not a Muslim ban. 1 billion Muslims are still perfectly free to apply for visas to visit the United States. It's people on a list of 7 countries, not 5, and that list was drawn up not by Trump, but by President Barack Obama, who, by the way, deported 2.5 million people in his 8 years in office. That was the greatest number of deportees ever in American history. He deported more than 1 million, more than George W. Bush did. So there's nothing dramatic about this list. Now, who's on the list? Libya, Somalia, Iraq, Syria. You're not seriously going to tell me that there's not a risk involved in terrorists coming to the United States or Europe from those countries, because they already have. Not to the United States as it happens, but they have created havoc, those terrorists, in Europe. Now, a blanket ban on entire countries is very stupid. That's what's stupid. What you should do is forensically examine applications from people who come from those countries, not ban the entire country. That's stupid for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a great recruitment tool for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It makes more people extremist. It makes more people fanatic if you behave unjustly in that way. And the second reason, Said, is that the one country that isn't on the list is the one country that's generating most of the terrorism in the world, namely Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the fountainhead of this extremism. It's the funder, the armor, the organizer of this extremism.
It's a hub. It's a hotbed. It's a main financer. But people, I don't know, generally they don't know. One time ago, I was protesting against when Saudis offered Pakistan, they were pressurizing Pakistanis to send their troops to kill poor Yemenis. And I had some of my friends who live in Saudi Arabia, and they were saying, oh, we send our troops. And I told them, hey, we have our own problems, and our troops are dying and fighting our own terrorism in the tribal areas. If Saudis are rich, I see Saudis over here in Phoenix, Arizona, they don't even say as-salam. They pass by, they think as we are the third-class Muslims. So they pass by us, and they drive one of the most luxurious cars, and they're always dating American girls, and they're roaming around the streets with their luxurious cars. And people in Pakistan are fighting for saying that, oh, we should send our troops to Saudi Arabia. No, we need Saudi Arabia to send their troops to Pakistan to help us over there. That was my concern. I raised voice at that time. And that's what I see most of the people, like in most of the third world countries, because there are so many stakeholders, because the government doesn't take care of them. So anyone who puts money into Pakistan, ultimately people start speaking for them.
Yes.
Because for them, it's a solitude. So they think that those are their well wishers.
Saeed, I hope to run into you the next time I'm in Arizona, which is a very sunshine state indeed. Thanks for that call. Get your point of view across on Brexit, on immigration, on the French presidential election, on the white paper, on Trump's rumpus with the Prime Minister of Australia over the telephone. Another day, another Trumpism. Frankly, I'm not upset that two politicians fell out with each other over the telephone. As a matter of fact, I wish they'd do rather more of it. A bit more honesty, that's my point of view. And if I was talking to the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Turnbull, I'd pretty certainly fall out with him too. Now, the question of immigration has loomed large over the entire EU debate. There's no denying that. In fact, everyone now accepts it. One man who was making the point and making the case much earlier than most was the former distinguished ambassador of the United Kingdom in various Middle East outposts, now a member of the House of Lords, Lord Andrew Green, who's the chair of Migration Watch, and he joins us now. Lord Green, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon to you, George.
Tell me what you think now will happen. Free movement, whatever the negotiation is, the free movement of European labour is dead in the water. No British government could conceivably sign a deal that continued free movement. What will that do to the profile of our population? Assume most of the 3 million EU citizens that are currently here remain here. Perhaps 2/3 of them is more likely, and assume that most of the British population living in the European Union remains there. Where does that leave the profile, the trajectory of our population?
Right. Well, there are a lot of questions in that. Let me start with the position that we're in now, which is that our population is increasing by about 500,000 a year. That is the entire population of Liverpool, which we're going to have to build every year, or if you like, Birmingham every 2 years. And 75% of that increase will be down to immigration. And I think people understand that. They may not know the numbers, but they understand that our population is going up much too fast and that immigration is a major cause of it. So I think that underlies what you said just now, which is there's no way a government can allow that to continue. And I think that the way forward, therefore, is to move to a situation of work permits for everybody, whether they're from the European Union or not. Because nobody's in any doubt that highly skilled migrants are very helpful to us and they add to our economy. The problem is the massive levels of immigration that I've just mentioned. And the numbers are like this. If we were to move to work permits for European workers, that would cut out about 100,000 lower skilled workers every year. The people who've been coming mainly from Eastern Europe, but not only from Eastern Europe, over the last 10 years, they would no longer be able to come and work here unless they were highly skilled. And that would help substantially. It would reduce our migration figures by 100,000. There's a lot more to do, but that would be a very useful first step.
That would mean then that those unskilled jobs, low-paid jobs, would be done by British people who have rather gotten out of the habit of that. And one of the things that would be demanded, not least by people like me, is that the wages and conditions of those unskilled jobs needs to be lifted through a higher national minimum wage, for example. What impact does that have on the economy?
Well, first of all, I agree with you entirely. I think the jobs can and should be done by British people, and I think that we do need to raise the salaries for working people. And by the way, at the same time, we need to increase productivity to pay for it. But the question really is, I think, by lying behind what you were asking, is what would happen to particular industries. And we've looked at that very carefully. The fact of the matter is, those Europeans who've come over the last 10 years, and many of them do a very good job in hotels and in the fields and so on, they're staying. If you look at the number of people who arrived from Eastern Europe in 2004, guess what? they're all here still. So there's going to be no cliff edge. It's not going to be a question of in 2 years' time they're all going home. Most of those who are here, they're settled, they're earning 3 or 4 times what they'd earn at home. Of course they're going to stay. So I think what we have to do is to look at each sector and not get carried away by claims from some employers that their sector will drop dead without them. I think that we should be very sparing indeed. In fact, I would start by saying we shouldn't have anybody except skilled workers. And employers are just going to have to pay more, improve conditions, train better, and get Brits to do these jobs.
Well, I agree with that entirely, and therefore let's move on from that perhaps rare moment of agreement between you and I on these issues.
I hope not, George.
Well, no, I hope not. Let's turn then to the issue of the work permits that will be issued. Is it your view that there should be no area of the world which is, as it were, a priority for allowing people in? I've always taken the view that if the Commonwealth is to mean something, and I wish that it meant more, that the first preference, if you like, for work permits, of course, as long as they were needed in the economy, should go to Commonwealth countries. Do you have a view on that?
Well, our view is that we should only have skilled workers, as I mentioned, and that there should be a level playing field. I see no reason why one nationality should have preference over another nationality. It entirely depends what skill you're looking for. If you're looking for someone who's fluent in some of the Indian languages or in Japanese or Chinese or something, then you're very likely to want someone from the region. On the other hand, there'll be other people from Europe who may have skills that are simply not available outside Europe. So I just don't think the nationality should come into it. I think it should be a matter for employers to say what skills they need, to make the case in order to get the work permit, and then to employ the person they think is best for the job.
You don't think there's as it were, a cultural point, a societal point, rather than a dryly economic one, that we have not a common culture, of course, with the Commonwealth, but many points of commonality, and of course pre-existing communities from historic immigration in the 50s and the 60s and perhaps part of the 70s. Do you not think, for the purposes of social cohesion, that it would be better to preference skilled Commonwealth workers?
I don't think it would make much difference to that, quite honestly. We have very large communities from all over the world, and we're only talking here about, what are we talking about? Maybe in total something of the order of 50 or 60,000 highly skilled people every year, many of which would go home again. I mean, one of the things about highly skilled is that they move on to another company in another country very often. So I think in terms of sheer numbers, it's not going to make any difference to the societal aspect. I think there are other things you can do on that front, and one of them would be what's known as the Youth Mobility Scheme. And that, I think, applies to a limited number of countries at the moment. Offhand, I'm not sure, but it certainly includes Australia and New Zealand. That enables people to get to know each other's country. And I hope that we could have something similar with Europe, so that our kids could go to Europe for, the limit is 2 years, I think, could go and sort of work in a bar and come back again. But that's quite different from having literally millions of people coming and working indefinitely. That has all the problems we've already touched on. But I do see advantage in young people being able to move around, as probably you and I did when we were kids.
Yes. This may be beyond your purview, but you're a man of many parts. Our birth rate is a problem, isn't it? That the birth rate in Britain, especially in some parts of Britain, I recall when we discussed this some years ago, in Scotland at that time, perhaps no longer, the population was actually falling. Firstly, because the birth rate was poor, and secondly, because not that many of the immigrants were headed for Scotland. They were headed mainly for places like London and other cities like it.
Well, let me divide that into two, if I may. As far as the UK is concerned, taking the UK as a whole, our birth rate is 1.8, which is a little bit short of what we need to renew our to maintain population. But of course, because of immigration, the thing is shooting up. So taking the UK as a whole, if we bring immigration under control, then we will be able to stabilise our population in a small island, by the way, at something like 70 or 75 million, which most people would think is quite enough. If you look at Scotland, that's a very interesting case. Scotland's Scottish population is not declining. It has been about 5 million for the last 50 years. And the most recent forecast is that it will increase by 7% in the next 25 years. So I think, to sum it up, the Scots don't have a problem of overpopulation, although the central belt, you know this far better than I, the central belt is quite crowded. But if you take Scotland as a whole, I don't think Scots feel that they're overpopulated. But many parts of England certainly are. So there is a difference there, but there's no reason why, and I can see your question coming, there's no reason why it shouldn't be possible, continue to be possible, to have a single immigration system which meets the needs of both countries.
Lord Green, I wish there was time for another question, but alas, there isn't. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on Drive Time this evening. Adam Bienkov is the UK political editor of the magazine Business Insider, and I thought I should get a business perspective on the white paper that was released today. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Now, the FTSE seems to have done well again today. The currency, I don't know, but I'd be surprised if it fell. Does that mean that business is coming to terms with the decision of the referendum?
Well, I think there's largely not a great deal in today's government white paper on Brexit. It's largely what we've heard before from the government and from Theresa May. Anyone who had listened to her speech in Lancaster House speech last month won't really see a great deal new in what they've put out today. So I don't think business will be too shocked or surprised by what was learned today.
What about this issue of the so-called hard Brexit, the non-membership of the single market? Do you think business accepts that there's no going back on that point? We will not be remaining as a member of the single market. What we are asking for now is to be able to trade freely with the member states of the European Union and they freely with us.
Yes, I think ever since Theresa May's Conservative conference speech back in October, it's been clear that we're going to be leaving the single market. As soon as she said that it was a red line that we needed to control immigration and that we needed to come out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, it was always going to be the case that we'd have to leave the single market. It took her a very long time to make that explicit, but I think it's long been understood within business and anyone who follows this closely that is the direction that we're heading in.
And how is that affecting business decision making? You know, the newspapers that support the Remain cause, which is most of them, are forever highlighting that this or that bank or financial institution is for the off just as soon as the Brexit is finalised. Others who support the Brexit are highlighting, for example, in the automotive industry, new investments, new job opportunities, and so on. In your view, as a balanced commentator on these things, what's the likely outcome?
Well, I think the city is always going to be attractive for business. I don't think we're going to see a mass exodus of people from the city. I think there will be certain sectors within the city that do leave, particularly elements of investment banking. So I think that you will potentially see big divisions of certain banks moving abroad, but I don't think, probably not to the EU, possibly more to New York and the US. So I think there will be an effect, and I think there is the sort of general uncertainty that we're going to have over the next few years will have an impact on the city. But London will always remain an attractive place for business to be in or out of the EU, and I don't think that's really going to change.
Now, what about the Trump effect? President Obama famously or infamously warned us that if we voted for Brexit, we'd go to the back of the queue. Trump says we're at the front of the queue. What does business make of all that?
Well, Trump says a lot of things. I don't think anyone can really read too much into his comments on that. The fact remains, any trade deal that we do with US is going to take many years. We cannot even begin negotiations until we've finished the 2-year Article 50 process. And I think it's going to be a very difficult process. I think a lot of the demands that the US are going to make of the UK during that process are going to be quite difficult for the government, particularly when it comes to issues such as pharmaceuticals and the NHS. And I think it's going to be a very difficult period. And I think whether or not we're at the front of the queue or the back of the queue, I think it's something that's going to take a long time. Any major trade deal that has been done in the past, free trade deal, has taken many years to complete, and I think this will be no different. And I think it'll be very politically and economically a period of uncertainty over that period.
Well, the TTIP that the US was negotiating with the EU was intensely controversial, at least amongst those who understood it, because it wasn't free trade. It was the most extreme form of American penetration of European societies, European economies. Trump doesn't like these kind of deals, as he proved when he scrapped the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you think that the US will insist in its negotiations with Britain on a TTIP kind of package?
Well, I mean, this is the main issue, really. Donald Trump is instinctively a protectionist. He's instinctively quite suspicious of these kind of deals. Theresa May is very much the opposite. She's in this white paper and in a recent speech and in everything that she's said since she's become Prime Minister, she is a free trader. She wants a free trade agreement. She set up a new department under Liam Fox specifically to secure free trade deals. So I think this is the difficulty that she's going to be having. On the one hand, she's leaving the EU and she needs to have a closer relationship with the US. On the other hand, what Donald Trump wants out of a trading relationship with the rest of the world is in direct contradiction with what Theresa May and the UK government want. So I think that's quite a difficult conflict. I'm not sure how they're going to square that circle.
Well, the cultural political pressure will be, of course, on a British government, an independent British government, also to protect our national institutions, our basic strategic industries like steel, for example, our national institutions like the NHS. She said in Parliament yesterday the NHS is not for sale, not now, nor will it ever be. But of course, the logic of a TTIP type negotiation is that it is for sale.
Yes, absolutely. I think those words that she made in Prime Minister's questions yesterday, that the NHS will never be for sale, never will, I think those will definitely come back to bite her. I think it's inevitable if we're going to be getting some sort of free trade deal with the US, that those issues are going to come into play. And if Theresa May will be under a huge amount of pressure to get a deal signed quickly, all of the advantages will be with the US. They're a much bigger power. They don't need to complete this deal quickly. They can essentially write out their list of demands, and if we want a deal quickly, we're essentially going to have to sign up to those. So I think that is a real risk going forward, is that the NHS and many areas of trade, on agriculture, food standards, we're going to have to sign up to things which may prove to be incredibly unpopular with the British public.
The one thing we've learned already about Donald Trump is that politics trumps the prevailing orthodoxy or the received wisdom. Isn't there a case for saying that Trump politically needs a quick deal with Britain?
I don't think it's
he is
really
a trifle,
high on there.
I suppose what I mean, Adam, he's a trifle isolated at the moment.
Well, I don't think that's something that's bothered him in the past. I mean, or at the moment we've seen today, he had a sort of furious phone call with Malcolm Turnbull, the of Australia. He seems to make a virtue of being sort of a loner and sort of irritating countries around the world. And he's only been in the job sort of a week and a half, and he's already had several rows. So I'm not sure that's going to be the main motivating factor for him, to be honest.
Well, it's been a pleasure getting your wisdom. Adam Bienkov, UK political editor of Business Insider. Thanks very much for joining us. The interview I've just had and the markets themselves indicate that the apocalyptic vision that people like George Osborne and David Cameron and Tony Blair and what's the lad that used to lead the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, were painting of a cliff edge and a catastrophe, Britain as Burundi, are all absolutely bogus. As Adam said there, the British market of soon, according to Lord Green, 75 million people, the British brand, the geostrategic position of Britain, the size of our economy, are all important reasons why, notwithstanding leaving the European Union, Britain will continue to be an important trading nation. At least that's my point of view. We'll hear after the break from Neil Hamilton, the leader of UKIP in the Welsh Assembly, former parliamentary colleague of mine, for his take on the Brexit White Paper. Now, the Brexit White Paper was introduced, I thought, with some integrity and indeed at points majesty by the Right Honourable David Davis today, one of the few men in the current British Parliament deserving of the title Member of Parliament. And although there was 77 pages, there wasn't a lot in it that we didn't already know, but everyone was clamouring for a white paper. So a white paper was produced. It wasn't exactly a puff of white smoke, but it was a white paper. So we're collecting everyone's point of view on it, everyone who's ready to talk to us, that is, and one of those is my old parliamentary colleague Neil Hamilton, who's the leader of UKIP in the Welsh Assembly. Neil, thanks for joining us. Neil? Hello? Well, I thought he was joining us, but he's not yet here. Now, let me take some of the texts that have come in. Phil Martin in Thurrock says, but there are still unskilled jobs that need doing. For example, on farms and factories. Permits should be on the basis of need, not just skills. Well, I'll tell you why Lord Green would disagree with you, Phil, and as would I. The reason British people don't go for these unskilled jobs on farms and in some factories, warehouses and so on, is because the wages are too poor. And the wages are poorer than they would otherwise be because there's a large number of people coming from East and Central Europe whose own economies would pay them. If you take an example of Bulgaria, for example, the average hourly wage in Bulgaria is £1 an hour. And, of course, it's rather more here. But the wages and conditions in these unskilled jobs will have to be dramatically enhanced through labour regulation and through a substantial hike in the national minimum wage, because these jobs will now have to be filled by British workers, and the employers will just have to act rather more clever and rather quickly to fill those positions with British workers. I think we've got Neil Hamilton back on the line. Neil, welcome.
Hello, George. I'm right at the end of the Llŷn Peninsula up in northwest Wales. So
how fantastic.
That's why we had difficulty, I think, contacting each other. But anyway, I'm delighted to be on your show.
Thank you, Neil. It sounds like a beautiful spot. Tell me this. Did you catch our old colleague David Davis's presentation of the white paper, and what did you think of it?
I have had a look at it on the internet.
What did you think of it?
Well, obviously there's not a lot of detail in it, but then it's not possible to at this stage to say what's going to happen as a result of our negotiation with the EU. But what it will do is restore Parliament's powers so that elected politicians, not unknown and unelected bureaucrats, make the laws of our land, and it'll be up to us as the electorate to ensure that we elect governments to produce the laws that we're happy with.
Well, that's right. I mean, I'm forever assailed as a supporter of Brexit by people on the left who say, well, we'll get a Tory government that will do this, that, and the next thing to us. And I always answer, well, only if we vote for it.
Exactly.
And if we vote for it, that's what we'll get. I mean, that is the bull point, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I remember at the time that we went into what we then called the common market nearly half a century ago, in the Tory party, one of the arguments that was put forward for it was that it would stop Labour ever nationalising anything again. It would stop Labour doing this, that and the other. You know, fundamentally undemocratic. The whole enterprise was conceived like that right from the start because Jean Monnet, who was the founding father of the EU, saw democracy as a problem because in the 1930s it had produced Hitler and Mussolini. So he thought that high-minded civil servants were much safer to entrust with power than the electorate.
Now, one of the things I'm discussing later in the show, Neil, is the imminent presidential election in France.
Yes.
Now, I threw it out. It came as a shock to some of my clever young colleagues through the glass. If Le Pen wins the presidency, which is by no means impossible, the European Union that we're leaving will almost certainly no longer exist by the time, perhaps, that we leave it.
Well, who knows?
People are rising up everywhere in
and bring
Europe.
It on, I say. Although, you know, I don't agree with lots that in the National Front policy programme in France, I do know this, that the euro has been a catastrophe for countries in southern Europe and it's working people throughout the continent that have been screwed to the floor by this conspiracy of elites to deprive ordinary people of power.
Indeed, the idea wasn't it, that Germany would be the industrial powerhouse of Europe and London would be its financial capital.
Yeah.
And this pincer has beggared people in almost every country in the European Union. We could run through them now from Greece to the Republic of Ireland and to our own country.
Yeah.
We have our industries, our manufacturing is now more or less a smoking ruin.
Absolutely. Well, you know, the euro was effectively a conspiracy from the start on the part of Germany to average the exchange rates of currencies, and the German currency being one of the strongest in the world would be artificially reduced. So that means, and as this is what has happened, they've got a permanent trade surplus, whereas the countries of southern Europe have a permanent trade deficit, and they are impoverishing the poorest parts of Europe whilst enriching themselves. So this is fundamentally unsustainable in the longer term, whatever happens or doesn't happen in the elections in France and Germany and elsewhere this year. This is a time bomb which will go off at some stage, because eventually it's like building a bridge without expansion joints. Under the strains and stresses that are bound to occur at some stage, it will ultimately break down, and that'll be the end of the euro project. But in the meantime, it will have done enormous damage to an entire generation of people.
Well, enjoy the peninsula. Neil Hamilton, thanks for joining us, leader of UKIP in the Welsh Assembly. Now, the last call was from Arizona, so where would the next call be from other than Mexico, where Graham is on the line in Mexico? Go ahead, Graham.
Good morning, George.
Good evening it is here.
Yes, good evening over there. It's only 11:30 here.
Fantastic. How is it in Mexico?
It's all right, nice and warm.
Are you anxious? Are they anxious about the effect of President Trump on immigration and trade and so on?
Well, they're a bit worried, but what they're more worried about is the wall. Now, as I'm a teacher over here, George, and I've spoken with my students about it because they're worried about the wall. And I ask them one question. I say, if he builds a wall, would it affect you? And honestly, my students actually turned around then and said, no, it won't. Which it won't affect us, really.
Well, it'll only affect people who are trying to enter the US illegally, won't it?
Well, Well, that's right. It affects those and the drug cartels.
You see,
but the average person in Mexico, it won't make any difference to them.
There's a kind of hysteria broken out around this question. Every country has a real or a metaphorical wall.
That's right.
We have just built a wall, not in our own country, but in Calais, in France.
In France, yes.
We spent millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money building a wall to stop people illegally entering our country.
Yes,
And
but do you know, George,
there'll be a lot
more illegals coming back from the United States, what they are going over now.
Is that a fact?
That is a fact. They give out the figures the other, I think it's just before Christmas time. And it actually stated more coming back now because of the economical problem in the United States.
Well, look, I have no problem with economic refugees. And if I were poor in Mexico, I might have a go at getting across the border myself.
That's right.
My own grandparents came from Ireland for precisely that reason.
That's right.
So I have no problem with it. But I also have no problem with the fact that a government, any state, will try and stop me coming illegally into their country, and for reasons of their own national economy, national integrity, sovereignty, and of course security. You mentioned the drug cartels. There is a great deal of crime in Mexico caused by these blood-sucking parasites in the drugs business.
Now, where we live, it's one of the main university cities, right?
Yeah.
And we don't get any problems around here. Because my personal opinion, I've mentioned to a lot of people about this, why there's no problems in this city, I believe the drug cartels send their children to this city, to university. And there's a deal. Keep out of that city.
Well, that's a very interesting observation. Now, Trump has put NAFTA on the table. He has said he wants to renegotiate it on the basis that a very large number of American companies, corporations, moved their productive capacity to Mexico on the basis that they could get the Mexican workers to work for less. And
that's right.
That
it's understandable.
Sorry?
It's understandable, really.
Well, if you're a rapacious capitalist, that's what you do. But the problem is, in a democracy, the husks that are left in the former industrial areas of the United States have all got votes. And that's why Trump is the president. He's the president because in that pathway of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and the so-called Rust Belt states of the U.S., people voted for him because he was promising to bring jobs and manufacturing back to America. And so they were voting entirely rationally, not stupidly, entirely rationally. Because
they want employment.
Indeed. And their jobs and industries were destroyed by the globalization projects like NAFTA. So what do you think, as an educated man, what do you think is going to be the basis of the renegotiation of NAFTA? What's Trump going to be seeking to achieve?
Well, honestly, I'm not quite well, the idea is he wants companies to go back. But the companies are not going to go back. They're going to stay here. Because Ford, he spoke to Ford the other week, and he came out and said, Ford are coming back. Well, they're not. All they're going to do is invest more in the United States, but they've cancelled one of their car plants here, what they were going to build, but they invested in the one they've got.
So they thickened the one they have and cancelled the new one.
That's right. So really, in real terms, they're still invested the same amount of money in Mexico because they're going to make the plant here twice as large.
But Trump might put a tariff on Ford and others, he's already threatened to do so, that if you don't move your plant back to the United States, then I'll slap a tariff on you and nobody will be buying your product anymore. That's a potent threat if he means it.
Yeah, but what? If the government's got any sense here, they're going to speak to these companies and say, look, if you stay, I'm going to help you with your tax. And everybody wins that way. Then he can produce the cars cheaper, so the 20% won't make a lot of difference.
Graham, it's been a pleasure talking with you out there in Mexico. That's Arizona and Mexico. Now, let's segue from Mexico to Glasgow. Not England, but Scotland. And my next caller, Robert. Go ahead, Robert.
Hello, George.
Hi, mate.
How you doing, mate? I was wanting to challenge you about the comment that you made about ISIS, about Trump's ban being a recruitment tool for ISIS.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm baffled to how you would come up with something like that.
Because it will make the sense of grievance in the Muslim world more acute. There's a swamp from which ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other extremist organizations draw their sustenance. And that swamp will be deepened by a further sense of grievance that entire countries are being branded as potential terrorists. So it's another chip on shoulders that have already got lots of chips, and justifiably.
I know, but if you tell me that a ban, just a temporary ban on people entering a certain country actually turns people into jihadists.
Well, it will turn a very small number, but it only takes a very small number to wreak havoc, and probably not in the United States.
You hit it right in the head there. It only takes a small amount of people to wreak havoc.
Yep.
And allowing masses of people into your country unvetted. You don't know who these people are to Adam. You're going to let them in.
Robert, these are straw men that you're erecting in order to knock them down. I precisely said that it's a much better, more forensic tool to vet most seriously, most severely, most forensically individuals rather than lump entire countries as being potential areas that are going to cause problems, and therefore everybody, even people, in the case of Iraq, even people that were working for your army as a translator are banned. That's just stupid.
But it's a temporary ban. If ISIS are wanting to get people in, this ban is going to be most effective against people who want to get in to do damage to the US.
But none have, Robert. You do know that, yeah?
The ordinary other one, that's not going to affect them. The only way it'll affect them is it'll take them a wee bit longer in order to get in.
Well, you say a wee bit longer. How long do you think this temporary ban is going to last?
Well, I suppose it can be until they decide. They're saying 90 days.
But let me assure you, it'll not be 90 days. It'll not be 180 days. It'll not be 360 days. This temporary ban will be extended and extended and extended.
I know, but look, but think about it in terms of this. See if it takes 2 years. That's the time it takes. The ban will eventually be lifted. There's got to be
and you don't think
time in order for him to get in the proper vetting that he deems that's appropriate in order to enter the US.
Well, let me shift tack.
If people can't realise that there is a potential threat for the other countries.
Well, there is. And you're talking to me as if I've denied it. That means you weren't listening. Countries like Somalia and Libya and Iraq and Syria and all the other places that we've bombed and invaded and occupied definitely have in them terrorists. But do you know that not one single terrorist has entered the United States as a refugee? The terrorists in America have almost always got white faces and pure American accents. Or They were born in the country that they have committed that crime in. Not one single refugee has killed one single person in the United States. You know that, do you?
Well, I know that now, but it doesn't make any difference about what colour they are. Terrorists are terrorists. You can only deal with homegrown terrorists within your country. You can absolutely deal with outside terrorists before they get into your country.
Well, I agree with that. I'm the last person to want terrorists coming into our countries. And there's a need for the most rigorous vetting of individuals. That's my point. Not collective punishment of countries that you yourselves have bombed, have invaded, have occupied.
They do that, and then they get done. They get claims of profiling.
But you say
that. How do you get run? How are you meant to get run this? You can't win both ways.
Well, the vetting.
If you take out individuals, what you're saying, they're going to be getting accused of profiling. Which
No. Every person who applies for a visa to go to anybody else's country can be vetted as seriously as that country wants. Now, the point I'm making to you is that the current vetting in the United States must be working, because no terrorists, none, have come in as refugees. Not a single one.
I know, but Trump's the new president, so it's within him to say, I'm going to have a look at every single process that's already been in place and make sure that they processes agree with what I agree with.
Well, he'll have to go some to improve on a record of zero terrorism. Zero terrorism from any refugee in the United States. Anyway, a pleasure talking to you. I've got to move on to Sweden. My goodness, the international reach of this show is now legend. It's Hussein in Sweden. Go ahead, Hussein.
Hello, Mr. George. Thank you for taking my call. First of all, I admire you very much. I've been following you for years.
Thank you, brother.
My question is simple but very dynamic and broad. What, in your opinion, are the duties of people around the world in regards to this illegal ban in the US, more than just standing up and speaking out on, say, social media and such?
Well, let me recap on something I said last night. Nobody has a right to go to the United States, nor in 99% of the cases do they have to go to the United States. And if the United States didn't want me to come, I wouldn't go. I've been arguing for people to turn their faces away from the United States all of my political life. The idea that the United States is, if you'll forgive the phrase, Mecca for anybody is very stupid. And it's especially stupid for Muslims, because the United States is the cause of untold misery amongst Muslims. So I'm surprised any Muslims want to go to the United States. But in the end, the Americans will decide who comes into their country and who must leave it. That's the same in Sweden, it's the same in Britain, and it's the same in the United States, Hussein.
Yes, if I could raise some points. Say, for example, a person of ignorance that would move there, and he's now having a family, and 20 years later, Mr. Trump is president, and now he can't go visit his other family in the rest of the part of the world. So in that case...
But that happens here, and that happens here, and it must happen to you in Sweden. I spent almost 30 years trying to get visas for Muslims in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and so on, just to come to a wedding or a graduation ceremony. And most of those visa applications were turned down on one bogus pretext or another. That already happens. Racism exists. These countries try to keep out as many people who might do a runner and stay, who might not leave when they're supposed to leave, and they take a very broad brush to that question, I can assure you, because I've even had people, constituents of mine, prepared to put up a bond of thousands of pounds in exchange for a visa for 5 days to attend a wedding or a graduation, and that's been refused. So there's nothing unique about this in terms of the United States, and certainly nothing unique about it in terms of Donald Trump. I assure you that US immigration policy was racist long before Donald Trump came along, as is Swedish immigration, as is British immigration.
Yes, it's true. I mean, well, let's say I'm born here in Sweden, but let's say I'm an Iraqi citizen. Yeah. I'm born there, and then suddenly Saddam Hussein is bombing us with weapons from Germany and even Sweden and whatsoever. And now I can't live there, so I have to go to Sweden. How can it not be my right to go there?
Well, if you're talking about if you're talking about refugees, that's a separate question from immigration. Every country has a moral and, above all, a legal obligation to take its fair share of refugees, and that duty is all the more incumbent on you if you are one of the countries that's causing the flight of the refugees in the first place. It's if you're doing the bombing, the invading, the occupying, if you're supplying the weapons to tyrants, then you have a greater responsibility to take refugees. That's a very clear moral and legal point. However, immigration is a different matter, and visa visits, are a different matter. Every country has the right to decide who comes in to its territory as a visitor or as an immigrant. And every country has the right to decide who can no longer live there, other than their own citizens, of course.
Yes, now I have had for all my years a difficult time disagreeing with you because I agree with most of your views, but what was I going to say?
Well, think about it and come back. Hussein, think about it and come back tomorrow night. His name is Renaud Tillet. He is a French politics commentator and a manager at Flint Global Consultancy. And he's here to talk to me about the French election and about why it matters, not just to the French, but to Europe as a whole. Renaud, thanks for joining us and for holding on. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Hi, George.
Now, I said earlier, let me run it past you if you didn't hear it, that François Fillon was now a dead duck. There's no way back for him from a €1 million scandal and climbing, just 3 months out from the presidential poll, the first round. And that as he was the front runner and almost certain, certainly very likely, the next French president, him crashing and burning opens up an entirely new vista in the French election process. One potential outcome being that a candidate of the left and a candidate of the far right are then pitted against each other in the second round, meaning a very important question being posed for centrists and moderate right-wing people in France. Would they cast their vote to the left or would they cast it to the far right? That's my working thesis, Renaud. What do you say to it?
Yeah, I think it's a good start. It's a nice summary of the situation. I mean, it's true that Fillon, so the conservative candidate, now looks toast, basically. So we don't know yet whether he's going to basically step down and not run, or whether he actually is going to hold on running. But even if he runs, his image is now badly damaged, and it's unlikely he's going to do a good score. So, I mean, as you know, the French election takes place in 2 rounds, and so the 2 final contenders compete against each other in the second round. So, I mean, the 2 lead contenders. And now it looks like the 2 leading contenders are Marine Le Pen, so the Front National leader, who is actually around 25-30% of voting intention, so that's very high. And the second one behind is actually a centrist candidate, Emmanuel Macron. So he's a very young and new figure in the French political landscape. So he's not exactly a man from the left, and that's where maybe I disagree with your analysis. So we might not have Le Pen against the left, but actually Le Pen against Macron, who is a centrist candidate.
Well, yeah, of course I understand what you're saying, and I'll come back to that. He was, of course, in the left government, if we can call it that. He was a member of the Hollande's socialist government, but that's not very left. And he was to the right of it, so I grant you that. But I have another working thesis that I'll come back to, involving somebody else. But just for listeners who are not as au fait with this as you and I, let's summarize what the allegations are against Fillon. The running has been made by France's equivalent of Private Eye magazine, Le Canard Enchaîné, and just tell the listeners what the principal allegations are.
Well, Fillon, had an image of someone being very honest, and very, not corrupt, basically. And and it was really one of his strengths. And what we found out in the last few weeks is that he had actually employed his wife for many, many years, but also his kids. And he had also had some private business activities while he was an MP. So, I mean, he employed his wife and his kids, or his son and his daughter as advisors when he was an MP. And if you cumulate, if you calculate the overall amount of pay that his wife and his kids have got, let's say over 10 or 15 years, you arrive, you get to a figure which is close to 1 million euro. So it's a huge sum. And that means they probably got much more than, the average MP assistant gets. So the thing is important to understand is that in France, it's legal when you're an MP to employ your relatives. But of course, now that it's public and that so first, French people didn't know about that, and so they are surprised to see Fillon actually doing that. And secondly, it's really the level of pay they got, which is a bit shocking.
Isn't there is a third aspect, Renaud, that obviously is just an allegation at this point, though the police raided the Assemblée Nationale yesterday on this to take away papers and so on. The allegation is, and it's only an allegation, that she and they were being paid but not actually working, that they were ghost jobs, in fact.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, this is really the question which everyone, there is no strong evidence, basically, of them having actually, spent time in the office and done some actual work. A lot of people just don't remember seeing them around, and this.
She had no parliamentary email. She had no desk, no presence in it, and so on. So, let's agree. I think we do that he's toast. The only question is whether he quits and the mainstream Conservatives choose another candidate, maybe Alain Juppé, the second in the ballot for that post, although he said he doesn't want to. But if he's toast, it's more likely that either the centrist Macron or, and here I want to put this to you, that the man who's come from nowhere to win the Socialist Party nomination, the Benoît Hamon, who's called the French Jeremy Corbyn, who has doubled his ratings from 8 to 17% in just a few days, that he could emerge as the other candidate in the final round. What do you think of that?
Yeah. No, it's true. Macron has, has been quite high in the polls now for 2 or 3 months. And it looks like it could, he can sustain, this momentum, because he's someone who appeals to both the center-right, the center-left, to young people in general, because he's young, he comes from outside the political system.
Is he a kind of Tony Blair figure, Renaud?
Yes and no. No, yes, in the sense that he wants to overcome the sort of left-right division, and so he doesn't really have an ideological approach.
That sounds quite similar to Tony Blair. He's a kind of third way politician, isn't he?
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, in terms of his platform. But in terms of his personal trajectory, not really, because he's really not a party person. 2 years ago he was known by no one in France because he was just an advisor to Hollande, and then Hollande appointed him minister, and 2 years later he stepped down from the government and he decided to run for president. So it's a quite atypical trajectory, and I think that's also what appeals to people. Now, talking about Hamon, yes, clearly there's also a dynamic there. It's very interesting because he was not expected to win the socialist primary, so there was a primary election in the Socialist Party, and he was seen a little bit as the outsider, the guy coming from the left. And yes, he won. So it's true. There are some parallels here between Corbyn and Hamon. Now, Hamon is, interestingly, is relatively young as well, so mid-40s. His left, or let's say his platform, is very much, he wants to embrace sustainable development, ecology, post-materialism. So I don't know if that's clear. And this is also quite new on the left. So now I'm not sure he can really, his appeal will be large enough. He will clearly appeal to people on the left. But to win a presidential election in France, you also need to get the vote. You also need to get the votes from people in the center. And this, I'm not sure he can actually do that. He has, his main proposal is a universal basic income.
Yeah.
So everyone in France would get a basic income. Now, it's quite radical, and at the same time, a lot of people talk about this idea everywhere in Europe.
Yeah.
So it's not completely mad. I think it's an interesting idea, but I think to a lot of people in France, the first reaction is, oh wow, This is way too generous. It's going to cost us millions, and who is going to pay for that, and so on.
I've only got time for one more question, which is a pity because I'd like to talk to you for much longer. If Le Pen wins the presidency, is that the end for the European Union? Will France begin a Frexit, in other words?
Yes, I think, it's quite likely. Clearly she wants to, the first thing she wants to do is basically to pass a law in France saying, well, French law is above EU law. So basically, you just say, well, we will stop implementing EU law, if we disagree. So you kind of re-establish sovereignty. And that's exactly what here the UK is doing now.
Yeah.
Now, what she also wants to do is to have a negotiation with the EU. And she wants to see if she can reform the EU. So transform the EU into a more intergovernmental institution. So that means national governments talking to each other only. So you basically scrap Brussels institutions. And she says, well, if I manage to do that, great, and we can keep the EU. But if I don't, then we will leave. So yes, clearly, but clearly, if she were elected, this would represent a massive change in the EU, and I think typically the Germans, so Angela Merkel, is very anxious about that.
In a word, Renaud, because there's only time for one, can Le Pen win?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because she's not trusted by a majority of people in France. So she can probably get something like 30-40% of the vote in the second round, maybe 40, but that's the maximum she can get.
Thank you very much indeed. Renaud Tillet, French politics commentator, manager at Flint Global Consultancy. James in Luton wants to talk about refugees, so let's hear from him. Go ahead, James.
Hi, George. Firstly, I'd just like to revert back to your comment in which you said there have been no terror attacks made by a refugee in America. Can I bring your attention back to November the 29th and the Ohio State University terror attack, where a Somalian refugee who entered the US in 2014 mowed down and injured 11 American citizens?
He did injure them. He didn't kill them. It's killing I'm talking about.
Okay. Secondly, in regards to Brexit, as a former MP or an MP, I'm not up to date on you. With Owen Smith voting against the constituents in Pontypridd, isn't he abusing his power?
Well, I must say I had to laugh in the interview that he did with my colleague Julia Hartley Brewer when he described his action as Churchillian. Now, I cannot think of anyone less Churchillian than Mr. Pfizer, Owen Smith, unless he meant the Churchill nodding dog, you know, the advertisement for Churchill Insurance. He might be Churchillian in that sense, but in no other. Now, I've got no problem with a member of Parliament having an issue that on which he disagrees with his or her constituents, and if they want to make a stand, they're fully entitled to do so. But they must be ready to pay the political price for that. And I think that Smith and others, Bryant in the Rhondda, for example, and others, Craig in Wakefield, and elsewhere that we can't talk about because of the rule forbidding us to discuss the current by-elections. I think that parties and politicians not only will pay a price, but should pay a price.
Can I bring you back to this? I've been looking online earlier. It's the Attorney General's reference, number 3 of 2003. The offence is committed when a public officer acting as such willfully neglects to perform his duty and or willfully misconducts himself to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public trust in the office holder without reasonable excuse or justification. The suspect must not only be a public officer, the misconduct must also occur when acting in that capacity. His constituents voted to leave. He's abusing his power as an MP.
No, believe me, I never thought the day would come when I'd be defending Owen Smith, but you cannot call it misconduct that he voted the way his conscience dictated to him.
But his conscience is irrelevant because his constituents voted to leave, so you should honour their wishes.
No. If, for example, every single one of my constituents wanted me to reintroduce the death penalty, I would never vote to reintroduce the death penalty. But I'd be ready to pay the political price for it at the next general election. So it's simply, it's a misuse of the word misconduct to attribute it to a political judgment made by a member of Parliament. So although I have no time at all for Owen Smith, it's ridiculous to say that he's committed any act of misconduct. But it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure disagreeing with you, James. Iqbal Tamimi at Arab Media Watch asks or states, if you were a woman living in Saudi Arabia under the guardianship of a nasty, ignorant male, the USA will be a dream. Well, that's of course true, but that doesn't give you a right to emigrate to the United States. There is no right to emigrate to the United States. There is no right for any country to be forced to accept you as an immigrant, however miserable your situation under your nasty, ignorant male guardian is. That isn't a qualification for political asylum. It doesn't make you a refugee, and you have no automatic right, Iqbal, to emigrate to anywhere. And the United States is no different to any other country in that regard, and it is no different under Trump than it was under Obama. I keep saying this, but it seems that quite a few people either can't or probably won't get it into their minds. Barack Obama deported more people from the United States than any president in the United States history. He deported 2.5 million people, almost 1 million people more than George W. Bush did. He dropped bombs, by the way, at a rate of 1 every 20 minutes over that 8 years. He had a meeting every week in the White House and decided where he was going to drone. And as we saw in Yemen yesterday, with the first of Donald Trump's invasions into other people's countries, these absolutely unguided attacks kill innocent people and fan the flames of extremism. What happened yesterday with Trump, it was planned under Obama, but it's happened under Trump's watch, was that a group of American commandos invaded a place in Yemen, and they killed 10 Yemeni women, 5 Yemeni children, including the 8-year-old daughter of somebody, a cleric, that they had killed in a drone attack some years before. Now, if there's anybody out there who imagines that what happened yesterday in Yemen has made the world a safer place rather than a more dangerous place, then they're not paying attention. The facts are, if you deal out death and destruction, it will blow back on you. And if you make a blanket ban on 7 countries, some of the countries that have been subject to death and depredation on an unbelievable scale over the last 15 years, you're making more extremism, not less. You're making more terrorists, not fewer. That's the long and the short of it. Adi at Panoptician 76 says, take the jobs back, be replaced by automation. Who will they blame them? Well, let me tell you something. In the 1940s, I think, Henry Ford told the United Auto Workers Union of America, I could replace all of your members with robots. And those robots will work for me forever, for no wages, and I could produce these cars without you. And the union answered, in that case, Mr. Ford, who will buy your cars? If nobody's working at high-paid, high-skilled jobs, where is the purchasing power to buy your goods? And even worse, if you are a politician, who's going to vote for you if you throw people out of work to be replaced by automation, by robot? Amran Khan says, what about the British government? They are not better. The UK is as racist as the US. Well, there's racism in the UK and there's racism in the US. And as I've always been brought up to know, if you think Britain's racist, you've never lived in France. So racism exists everywhere. And it's a pernicious thing, it's a poisonous thing, and it must be fought against, whoever is the president, whether you're in the EU or out of the EU. And here's Phil again in Thurrock. But he says, skills obsession is crazy. Doing a low-skilled, mundane job is a skill in itself. Well, of course, Phil, every job involves skills, even the one I'm currently doing now, just talking to you. it needs skills. But the point is, we oughtn't to accept a future, and we've now rejected that future, where workers from Bulgaria, where they earn £1 an hour, are brought to England to work in unskilled jobs, or other parts of Britain, to work in unskilled jobs, putting our own unskilled workers out of work, depressing the wages for the job, and putting pressure on public services and rents to boot. It's very difficult to recruit to a trade union, to fight for a proper rate for the job when there's 100 people looking for every job. That's quite simple. But it's not been grasped by John Scoff, and I'm surprised at you, John, who says, is it not landlords and bosses that dictate wage and rent levels then, George? Well, of course it is, John. That's precisely the point. Landlords will charge you as much rent as they possibly can, and the more people chasing a limited number of houses and apartments, the higher the rents go. And the more people chasing unskilled jobs, the lower the wages go. It's not exactly rocket science, John. You don't need to be Einstein to work it out. Employers and landlords are employers and landlords to squeeze the maximum amount of property from their assets. And if you don't control the labour supply, then you're adding to the problems you already have in the unequal contest between labour and capital. If there were 100 people outside this door right now who could do this job that I'm doing as well as I can do it, my wages would go down, or I'd be put out of work. Which part of that don't you understand, John? So take your infantile leftism elsewhere. Go ahead, Nicola.
Good evening. I'd like to talk about Brexit. I'd just like to say how pleased I was it got through the first reading last night, and I just wonder why we had all that fuss of going to appeal. Why didn't you just let it be read in the House of Parliament in the first place?
Well, the point is, as I tried to explain ad nauseum last night, the government told the people that they would accept the verdict of the referendum. They told them in writing, in the £9 million brochure, which they controversially sent to every elector in the run-up to the vote. We will abide by your result, they said. So it was automatic, axiomatic, that you should pass Article 50 legislation.
Yeah, well, I'm all in favour of the MPs discussing it, because after all, they've got to get us the best deal possible when we start talking to Europe.
Yes, of
course. No problem with it being read, but I just don't know why she was frightened of actually bringing it to the House and getting approval of the House, because after all, we wanted sovereignty, we wanted things to return for our own Parliament to discuss things. I can't, it just seems to be, I just wonder who's going to pick up the bill for this, really, because I'm pleased it's got through, I'm pleased that they've discussed it, and I just hope that they can work together and get us the best deal.
OK, Nicola, not a great line, but a very good call. Thanks for it. Guy is in Stoke-on-Trent. Let's hear from Guy. Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, George, just two comments about Donald Trump. The first one with his ban from those predominant Muslim countries on the grounds that it's enhanced safety for his own electorate.
Yes.
I wonder about the intellect of the electorate, because last year there was almost 14,000 homicides attributed to shotguns in the States. There was one mass shooting for every day of the year, such as schools, shopping malls, places of worship. The resources and the time spent would be better served tackling that issue, which is thousands, as opposed to the 17 fatalities which were attributed to terrorism in the States last year.
Well,
I know they've got the Second Amendment, but it just seems nuts.
Well, I agree with you entirely. We'll come on to your second point in a minute, but I agree with you entirely, though it isn't either or. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a government protecting itself and protecting its borders from people who might come in and cause harm to the people of all colours and races who are already living there. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And as long as that is applied in an intelligent way, in a way that doesn't make things worse, then so much the better. Now, the gun issue is, to me, standing out a mile, Guy. I forget the number now, but it's something like 1.25 million Americans have been killed by gunshot in the United States since Jack Kennedy's assassination in 1963. And I was already 9 years old then. So they're in the period of my life from 9 years old to now, 1.25 million, might be more, Americans have died as a result of gunshot in the United States. Now, the Second Amendment that you talk about was passed at a time when people lived in isolated homesteads, when the cowboys were riding the range, when the original people of America were still struggling against the land grab and the illegal settlement of their land and so on. It's understandable, the right to bear arms in those circumstances. It's even understandable that everyone might have the right to have a pistol. But we're talking about a country where you can go in to the equivalent of Tesco and buy an automatic weapon. An automatic weapon that can slay huge numbers of people. And as you say, in 2016, did so at the rate of one every single day, Guy.
That was a mass shooting. The figures which are on the website.
Exactly, a mass shooting, you're right.
Just under 14,000 people. I just think if I lived in America, I would be greater terrorised by that than the threat of someone coming from the Middle East. I wonder about how analytical they look at this evidence when these presidents propose to protect them. But the second thing I'd like to say, George, and the last is the photo shoot of Mrs. May and Mr. Trump.
Yes.
And it looked peculiar, and
it did.
Maybe that's a light. When they were holding hands, I don't think I've ever seen world leaders holding hands before. But maybe with Mr. Trump, better he grabs a hand than some other part of her anatomy.
Well, it turns out, to my absolute astonishment, that she was holding his hand because he has a fear of steps. And she held his hand, the poor soul, because he was scared of the steps in the Rose Garden in the White House. At least that's how it's been reported. My clever friends through the glass are looking so astonished. It might be a contested point, but I read this in the US media, that Trump has a medical condition in which he's afraid of steps. Now, I know that Trump Towers have very fast elevators, because I've stayed in one. But the Rose Garden, I don't know, he needs to put a ramp or something so he doesn't have to hold the hand of every visiting political leader that comes to meet him. Guy, thanks for that in Stoke-on-Trent. I wanted to read this email. It's from Mark in Bulgaria. He's in Plovdiv, which I know quite well, actually. He says, when we talk about the amount of immigration into the UK, which is harmful in my opinion, we never mention the damage it is doing in countries like Bulgaria, where I live, that has lost more than 40% of its population. The economy is in free fall, and only EU funds are keeping it afloat. What a farce, he says. Mark, that is a brilliant email, the best one of the night, not least because it tees me up to make one of my favourite points. There is nothing left-wing about mass immigration. It happens to poor countries who lose the most energetic, the most enthusiastic, the cleverest, the best educated of their people, to rich countries where employers exploit their labour, their education, their skill, their enthusiasm, their activism, for their own purposes. It's like the issue of refugees. I don't want any refugees. I want all the refugees to be able to go home. Because somebody asked me the other day, how many Syrian refugees should we take? My answer is we should be stopping the war in Syria so that the Syrian refugees can go back home. Because what is the point of all the best of the Syrians, the most active, the ones that were able to get here, the ones with a greater facility for languages, the ones in the prime of their productive life? They are lost now to Syria. This is a huge blow to Syria and other countries that have lost these huge numbers of refugees. It's better by far if there is no mass immigration, because that merely consolidates, compounds the ill division in the world between the richest countries and the poorest. There's nothing left-wing about agitating for the emptying of Bulgaria of its workers. Because, as Mark just points out, and how wonderful, we've been in Mexico, we've been in Arizona, we've been in Bulgaria this evening, how wonderful it would be if the Bulgarian workers were building up Bulgaria. It would be wonderful, and they'd be happier if they were able to do so in a way which allowed them to build for the success and prosperity of their own families. That brings us, alas, to an end, because I'm about to be succeeded in this place by the king of radio, James Whale himself.